Welcome to the debate. Imagine for a second that archaeologists unearth this ancient, blood-stained document. Two scholars sit down to translate it.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So the first scholar looks at the rigid transactional language of it, the weights, the measures, the payments, and concludes it's a strict ledger, like a binding contract detailing a profound debt that had to be paid off to the very final drop.
Sounds pretty grim.
It does. But the second scholar looks at the exact same document, considers who wrote it and who it was written for, and sees something entirely different. They see a love letter. It's just written in the only stark, severe vocabulary that the recipient of that era would actually understand.
And that tension really is the absolute crux of theological history, isn't it? I mean, are we looking at a ledger of cosmic debt, or are we looking at a pedagogy of love dressed up in ancient metaphors?
Exactly. Today, we are looking at a provocative historical analysis by biblical commentator Marie-Noël Thabut. This was published on the blog of Thierry Jallis, and it tries to completely upend how we read these ancient texts.
Yeah, Thabut is analyzing the foundational texts of early Christianity here, specifically Peter's speeches, his first epistle, and of course the famous Road to Emmaus narrative in the Gospel of Luke.
Right. And the central disagreement we are exploring today is this. When these texts claim that Christ's suffering and death were necessary, what does that actually mean?
It is a massive question with huge implications, because if it's necessary, we have to ask, well, necessary for whom? Are we dealing with a divine requirement for merit and atonement? Did God need a transaction to balance the cosmic scales?
Right. And I will be representing the perspective that, according to Thabut's analysis, this scriptural necessity is entirely non-transactional. It is not an arithmetic, divine requirement to earn merit. Rather, it's purely a pedagogical revelation, a demonstration of gratuitous love meant to free humanity from fear.
And I will be representing the contrasting perspective. I argue that this interpretation, frankly, overly sanitizes the ancient texts. The pervasive use of terms like ransom and precious blood demonstrates a genuinely sacrificial and obligatory framework that goes way beyond a mere demonstration.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how Thabut approaches these texts, because she is really trying to strip away the arithmetic readings of the Bible.
Which she calls a temptation, right?
Exactly. A temptation that betrays the scriptures. When you look at her analysis of the Emmaus story in Luke 24, Jesus asks the two disciples, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer? Thabut argues that this necessity was not God the Father demanding a blood payment. The necessity was for humanity.
Us. We were the ones who needed it.
Yes, we are the ones who needed love to go to the absolute end. And if you are listening to this and wondering why an execution would be required to show love, Thabut's point is that humanity is locked in a cycle of violence.
Right.
For God to truly reveal himself as pure gift, he had to absorb the absolute worst of human hatred, abandonment, and death without retaliating. She connects this directly to the core theme of Thierry Jallis's blog, which is liberty.
Right, moving away from fear.
Exactly. This ultimate revelation moves believers away from the superficial, slave-like fear typical of ancient pagan religions. It brings them into the true freedom of filial fear, and she defines that as tenderness, respect, and absolute trust in a father.
Well, I come at it from a different way. I completely acknowledge that Thabut's interpretation is philosophically appealing, especially, to modern sensibilities that are deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a transactional God.
Sure, it's a very modern discomfort.
It is. But her framework really struggles against the actual, literal language of the texts she relies on. Let's look closely at 1 Peter. The text explicitly says believers are ransomed by a precious blood, that of an unblemished lamb.
Which she tries to frame as a free gift.
Right, she tries to soften this. She frames it strictly as a free gift by pointing out that Peter says we weren't bought with corruptible gold or silver. But using ancient sacrificial terminology inherently carries a heavy weight of transactional atonement.
But doesn't the rejection of gold and silver specifically negate the transactional element? I mean, he's explicitly saying we aren't using currency here.
No, I don't think you can just dismiss the requirement of a sacrifice as a temptation. That ignores the entire Jewish historical context of the Passover lamb. The blood of the Passover lamb in Egypt wasn't just some nice metaphor for love.
Well, no, it was protective.
It was a strict, literal requirement for salvation from the angel of death. You had to paint the physical blood on the doorposts, or you died. First-century readers knew exactly what an unblemished lamb represented. It wasn't just a symbol of innocence. It was the designated mechanism for absorbing consequence.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it differently, especially when we look closely at who Peter is actually addressing in that letter.
Okay, let's look at the audience.
Right, so Thabit provides this vital historical reconstruction of 1 Peter 1:17-21. She notes that Peter is writing to believers in the provinces of modern-day Turkey, and the key phrase he uses is that they were freed from the superficial conduct inherited from your fathers.
Which is a very specific phrasing.
Exactly. But points out that Peter, who was a devout Jew, would never describe the ancestral Jewish faith as superficial conduct. He is clearly writing to non-Jewish converts, most likely the God-fearers.
And for those who might not know the term God-fearers, were essentially pagans who hung around the Jewish synagogues. They respected the monotheistic God and followed some moral laws, but they hadn't taken the full plunge into conversion.
Right, like undergoing circumcision or keeping strict kosher diets.
Yeah, they were on the periphery.
Exactly. So Peter is explicitly writing to pagans, and you have to understand what a pagan thought about the divine. For a pagan, the gods are terrifying, capricious entities.
Right, if your crops fail, it's because Zeus or Poseidon is angry.
Yes, and they need to be bought off with a sacrifice, a transaction. So Peter is trying to redefine their entire concept of what it means to fear God. He leans on Psalm 102 and 103 to say, no, look at the tenderness of the Lord. He remembers that we are dust.
But he still uses the word ransom.
Yes, but the ransom Peter talks about wasn't paid to God to appease his wrath. Think of it like this. Imagine a parent running into a burning building to save their child.
Okay.
The fire doesn't demand a transaction of suffering. The parent isn't trying to earn merit with the fire to buy the child back.
No, obviously not.
The burns the parent sustains are simply the necessary cost of love acting in a broken, dangerous reality. The child is ransomed from the fire, absolutely, but it is not a commercial transaction.
Right, because the fire doesn't take bribes. It is a beautiful analogy.
Exactly. Thabit is arguing that the cross is the burning building. The suffering is the cost of entering our brokenness, not a payment to a celestial bank.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered the specific economic vocabulary Peter insists on keeping in that exact passage?
You mean the silver and gold?
Yes. If his goal was to completely abandon the transactional nature of salvation and ship these pagans to a purely non-transactional, filial trust, he had the vocabulary to do so. He could have just spoken of a rescue, like a shepherd pulling a sheep from a ravine.
Which is a common biblical image, yeah.
Exactly. But he doesn't. He explicitly contrasts corruptible currency, silver and gold, with a superior incorruptible currency, the blood of Christ.
But again, he's saying silver and gold couldn't do it. He's rejecting them.
Yes, but swapping one currency for a higher currency still implies that a profound debt had to be paid to liberate humanity. De Boot argues that Peter is telling them the liberation is free because it's not with silver or gold. But I look at that text and see it saying the exact opposite.
That it wasn't free at all?
It wasn't free. It was infinitely costly. Earthly metals weren't enough to pay the cosmic debt. It required the blood of an unblemished lamb. You can't just wave away the mechanics of the atonement by focusing only on the emotional outcome of filial trust. The mechanism matters.
But does it matter to them in a ledger sense?
Absolutely. If you tell a first-century person that they were bought with blood, they're thinking about the altar, the priest, and the ledger of sin being wiped clean through a substitutionary death.
But if we're going to understand how this non-transactional view took hold, we really have to look at the psychological state of the people who first had this explained to them, because they were just as confused as anyone else trying to parse out this new theology.
They definitely were.
Let's look at the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. These two disciples are walking away from Jerusalem just days after the crucifixion, and they're completely crushed.
Understandably so.
They say to this stranger they meet on the road, "We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." and Jesus has to systematically take them through Moses and the prophets to interpret the scriptures concerning himself.
Right, and the Boud's own analysis gives away the game here, I think. She admits that for Jesus' contemporaries, a crucified man was fundamentally unacceptable.
Yes, because of the curse.
Exactly. Because according to Deuteronomy 21, anyone who is hung on a tree is cursed by God. The disciples were crushed because they expected a political military liberator who would violently expel the Romans. Instead, they got a traumatic, humiliating execution of their leader.
Which shattered their entire worldview.
Completely shattered it. So what do? I'm sorry, but I just don't buy the non-transactional idea here. Let me tell you why. The early church, writing this narrative decades later, had to interpret the scriptures to make sense of a massive cognitive dissonance.
You're saying they were doing damage control?
They had a catastrophic defeat on their hands. To survive psychologically, they had to systematically retrofit the Jewish scriptures to turn a catastrophic defeat into a theological victory. They scoured the ancient text to find a way to make a suffering Messiah necessary.
Because otherwise...
Because if it wasn't necessary, then Jesus was just another failed revolutionary who got crushed by the Roman war machine.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the early church was just frantically making things up to cover for a failure. Theobald explicitly argues against this idea of mere retrofitting. She insists that Jesus was demonstrating the true continuity of God's plan.
But how is it continuity if it went against everything they believed?
When Luke writes that leurs yeux s'ouvrirent, their eyes were opened, it wasn't that Jesus was changing the scriptures, or that the early church was forcing a square peg into a round hole to deal with their trauma. He was opening their eyes to a deeper layer of the text that they, in their desire for military and political power, had completely missed.
But how is finding a deeper layer that completely contradicts the plain reading of the text not retrofitting?
Because the continuity was always there. Jesus was showing them that God's victory doesn't look like human military victory. If you read the prophets, the suffering servant in Isaiah is right there. Humanity just couldn't conceive of a God who wins by suffering rather than dominating. Thabit writes that we shouldn't reduce the Old Testament to a mere prop for the New, but that the disciples realized Jesus' life was the ultimate revelation in historical reality of the Father's love.
But the continuity you were talking about is only visible if you radically change the original historical meaning of the texts. Let's look at how this played out publicly. Let's look at Peter's speech at Pentecost in Acts 2, which Thabit also analyzes.
Okay, the Pentecost speech.
Peter stands up in front of a massive crowd of Jewish pilgrims, and what is his core piece of scriptural evidence that Jesus is the Messiah? It's Psalm 16. You will not abandon my soul to the netherworld, nor will you suffer your Holy One to see corruption.
Exactly, and Thabit offers a really illuminating look at the original context of that psalm. She explains that it was likely written about the Levites.
The priests?
Yes, the priestly class in ancient Israel. When the land of Canaan was divided among the Israelite tribes under Joshua, the Levites got no territory. Their inheritance, their portion and cup, as the psalm says, was God himself. They relied entirely on the Lord for their sustenance, literally living off the tithes of the other tribes.
Okay, I follow that. But how does that connect to a biological resurrection?
Because Peter brilliantly takes this profound historical image of absolute physical reliance on God and shows how it was ultimately fulfilled in Christ. Christ was the ultimate Levite, the true high priest.
I see where you're going.
His reliance on the Father was so absolute that he gave up everything, even his life. And because of that total reliance, the Father vindicated him through the resurrection. It's not retrofitting. It's taking a historical truth and showing its ultimate perfect expression.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered the actual timeline of how these beliefs evolved? Look closely at Thabit's own historical notes in her commentary. She openly admits that belief in individual resurrection, the idea that a single person would physically rise from the dead, appeared very late in Israelite history.
Yes, around the 2nd century BC.
Right, during the Maccabean period. And if you're listening and aren't familiar with the Maccabean revolt, this was a time in the 160s BC when the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes was brutally persecuting the Jews. He was slaughtering people just for keeping the Sabbath or refusing to eat pork.
It was a horrific period.
It was a crisis of martyrdom, and the Jewish thinkers had to ask a terrifying question. If good, righteous people are being horribly tortured and killed for obeying God, Where is the justice? That trauma is what catalyzed the theology of an afterlife and resurrection. God had to have a plan for justice after the grave, or else the universe was purely chaotic.
I agree. The historical layering of the texts is undeniable, yes.
But don't you see the implication of that layering? When Psalm 16 was actually written centuries before the Maccabees, it was absolutely not about a resurrected individual. It was about the survival of the people of Israel against the threat of idolatry.
You're saying it was purely national?
Yes, you will not abandon my soul to the netherworld originally meant God will not let our nation be destroyed by pagan empires. It was about national survival. Peter takes a psalm that historically meant God will keep our nation from being wiped out, and he applies it literally, physically, to the biological corpse of Jesus of Nazareth, not decaying in a tomb in Jerusalem.
Wow.
That is a radical theological pivot. It proves my point perfectly. The early Christians were not just uncovering what was plainly there, they were actively reshaping, reinterpreting, and repurposing ancient texts to establish a brand new doctrine about a dying and rising God-man.
I don't think it's a matter of repurposing in a deceptive or forced way, though. Verabot calls it the role of the first Christian generation to discover how the scriptures find their plenary sense, their absolute fullness in Jesus Christ. You are looking at the text purely as a static historical artifact.
Because it is a historical artifact.
But in the Jewish tradition, which the early Christians inherited, the Word of God is living and active. A prophecy or a psalm can have an immediate historical context, like the survival of the nation, and also hold a deeper truth that only becomes clear in the fullness of time.
A truth that conveniently solves their immediate theological problem.
It's more than convenience, it's typology. The Levite having no land and relying on God is a historical reality, yes, but it is also a profound theological type, a foreshadowing of the Messiah who strips himself of all earthly power and relies entirely on the Father. When Peter preaches to those thousands of Jews at Pentecost, he isn't trying to trick them with bad exegesis. He is showing them that the spiritual trajectory of their entire history has culminated in this man. And returning to the idea of necessity, Thaba explicitly points out that Jesus' life, teachings, and his parables constantly subverted the transactional scaffolding you're talking about.
How so? Where does he subvert it?
Look at the parable of the prodigal son. There is zero transaction there. The younger son wastes his inheritance, comes back rehearsing a speech to earn his way back as a hired servant, which is a literal transaction.
Right.
And what does the father do? He sprints down the road and forgives him before the son can even utter his prepared speech of repentance. Thaba argues that reading the cross as a transaction is a regression to the very pagan fear that Peter is trying to free his audience from.
So the necessity isn't a demand.
Exactly. The necessity of the cross was not a demand from God, but a reflection of the darkness of humanity. Jesus came to reveal the Father's unconditional love. Humanity responded with rejection, torture, and crucifixion. For Jesus to remain faithful to his mission of revealing pure love, he had to endure that rejection to the very end. The ransom is simply the price love pays to remain love in a world governed by violence. It frees us from the superficial conduct of thinking we have to earn God's love through endless, bloody sacrifices.
It is a fascinating synthesis Thomabit provides, I'll give you that. But it requires us to read the ancient texts through a very modern, almost philosophical lens.
You think it's too modern?
I do. If you are a first-century Jew or a God-fearing pagan standing in the courtyard, and Peter speaks of the blood of an unblemished lamb, you do not hear the price love pays to remain love. You hear sacrifice. You hear substitution. You hear the literal, bloody mechanics of the temple applied to a cosmic scale.
Even if those mechanics are being redefined.
But they aren't being redefined in the text as clearly as the boot suggests. I argue that the trauma of the crucifixion forced a psychological paradigm shift. If the Messiah was cursed on a tree, the only way to save the movement was to find a reason why the tree was necessary.
They had to make the death meaningful, so they reached for the language they knew: the temple, the lamb, the precious blood, the ransom. You cannot extract the concept of merit and transaction from the early church's theology, because it was the very scaffolding they used to build their understanding of the cross.
Which brings us to a really important point of convergence, actually. Both of us, and Thabit herself, agree that these texts represent a massive paradigm shift in how the early Christians understood God's intervention in human history.
Oh, undoubtedly. The shift from a conquering militant Messiah to a crucified one, and the subsequent rereading of the entire Hebrew Bible, is one of the most profound intellectual and theological pivots in human history.
Absolutely.
Whether you view it as a divine pedagogy finally culminating in the revelation of pure love, or the desperate, brilliant theological retrofitting of a traumatized community, the magnitude of the shift is undeniable.
Exactly. So, to summarize my position, I believe Thabit's commentary reveals a cohesive narrative across these texts. From Peter redefining the fear of God for pagan converts, moving them from terror to tenderness, to Jesus opening the eyes of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, we see a God who uses extreme, self-giving love to liberate humanity from superficiality and fear.
Right.
The necessity of the cross was not a divine demand for payment to balance a ledger, but the inevitable collision of divine love with human brokenness, demonstrating that love is ultimately stronger than death.
And to summarize my position, while the overarching theme of love is certainly present, I maintain that Thabit's analysis smooths over the rough, historical edges of the early church's theology. The actual language used by Peter and Luke retains deep, undeniable roots in ancient sacrifice, economic ransom.
The mechanics, as you said.
Yes. The trauma of the crucifixion required them to use the language of transaction. You can't just brush aside that vocabulary as a mere metaphor without ignoring the historical context and the psychological reality of the authors who lived it.
There is clearly much more to explore here, particularly in the historical context of the early church's scriptural interpretations and how those interpretations evolved as they engaged with both Jewish and pagan audiences. Looking at these texts through both a historical critical lens, examining the timelines of the Maccabean period and the evolution of belief, and a theological lens, asking what these texts reveal about the nature of divine love, gives us a much richer picture than either lens alone.
Absolutely. It forces us to sit with the tension of the text. We have to wrestle with the actual words on the page rather than trying to make them fit perfectly into either a rigid historical box or a sanitized theological theory.
Precisely. Which brings us right back to that ancient blood-stained document we imagined at the start. When you look at the foundations of this faith, what are you reading? Is it a strict ledger of cosmic debts paid out in the incorruptible currency of blood to satisfy a universal law? Or is it the ultimate love letter, written in the fierce, sacrificial vocabulary of the ancient world so that humanity could finally understand the depths of grace? We will leave that for you to decide.